Welcome to Mental Health Trailblazers, Psychiatric Nurses Speak Up. I am your host, Indrias Kassaye, and you are listening to Season 2 of the SAMHSA Minority Fellowship Program at the American Nurses Association's podcast, where we spotlight MFP fellows and alumni and their pioneering work to improve health outcomes for marginalized communities. We have so much to explore, so let's get started. Dr. Greywolf, welcome to Mental Health Trailblazers. It is a pleasure having you here with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And let me start with asking you to introduce yourself to our audience. If you could share a little bit about your background and your identity.
Okay. My name is Cynthia Taylor Greywolf, and I was originally born in New Mexico, but my formative years were spent in northeastern Oklahoma, which is the Cherokee reservation. I am from a Cherokee family. I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and I spent my formative years growing up with my Cherokee grandfather and my grandmother. And I have self-identified as Cherokee all my life.
And for somebody who, like myself, has very little knowledge of what it means to be Cherokee, what was growing up Cherokee like?
Well, growing up Cherokee in Oklahoma, in my family, it's like we were almost living in the 18th century because we lived in a little 3-room house that was basically falling apart. We had no running water, but we had a well. We had a wood stove, which we used wood to cook on as well as heat. And we didn't have any indoor plumbing. And basically where I lived was on a land allotment. And my family, surrounding family members, all lived on land allotments that were next to my grandfather's. And those land allotments were given to Native Americans back in the early part of the 1900s from the Dawes Commission, where property was kind of parceled up and given to natives, and then it allowed white settlers to come into Oklahoma area. This didn't just impact Cherokee, this impacted most all the tribes in that area. And so I grew up on a land allotment, and my grandfather originally had a land allotment up by the Illinois River and subsequently lost that land in, I think it was 1947-ish, because they were going to build a dam on the Illinois River. So he lost his land allotment and then moved and took over another land allotment for one of his brothers. And that's where I spent my formative years growing up. We practiced traditional Cherokee ways when I grew up with him, which means going to the stomp dances. He spoke Cherokee, but he wouldn't allow us to speak Cherokee. He spoke Cherokee with his brothers, sisters, and people of his generation.
And how would you describe the atmosphere or growing up? Was it a happy childhood?
There are parts of my childhood that were really happy, and then other parts I guess I considered normal because we didn't know any better. One of the things growing up in a Cherokee family, and this was very much a part of my family, was my grandfather drank alcohol, and then a lot of my aunts and uncles also had problems with alcohol. So my grandfather probably is the one that I remember the most because he had a significant problem with alcohol use disorder. And he also smoked a lot. That was another thing that impacted his health. But growing up with him meant that there would be periods of time when he would be quiet and thoughtful, and we could interact with him. And then when the alcohol would become involved, he would turn into a different person. And that actually greatly impacted our family over time. But honestly, I would tell you that at the time, growing up where I didn't know that that wasn't normal. So that's kind of a legacy that's been passed down through my family.
And when did you first begin to realize that this is not quite the way it should be, and that the rest of America looked and experienced things very differently?
There are several periods in my life where I would say at different levels of development where I've noticed that. One was when my grandfather, he committed suicide when I was 8 years old. And no one really knew why he did that, but everybody speculated it was because of the alcohol and for health issues as a consequence of that, because my grandfather actually could be a very dangerous man. But you have to realize that this really was like the wild, wild west. And so he would often carry a gun around. And when he would be drinking, he had a tree out in the yard that he used to shoot at. But my grandmother always was afraid he was going to shoot somebody. So there were always times when we had to leave and we'd have to get up in the middle of the night, walk down Highway 64 to my uncle's house for safety. And this was a fairly common thing. So when he committed suicide when I was 8 years old was the first time I began to think something was really not right in my 8-year-old mind. And then later throughout my life, I began to realize how different my childhood was from other people that I was working with. And that was when I was becoming a psych NP and I was in Boston, Massachusetts. I was doing an internship with Northeastern University, and they had placed me in a psychiatric facility that included a lot of Harvard psychiatrists. And I remember they asked me one day if I could talk about my experiences being Native American. And as I was speaking to them as a group, I realized they really had no idea. They were asking me questions like, where was Child Protective Services? And it's like there was no such thing as that. And this was normal life for me. Their question to me too was, well, do you feel any consequences, or do you experience any trauma from this? And honestly, at that time, it was like, I really would have answered no, but that really wasn't the true answer. The true answer is that I had been exposed to many traumatic events in my life that I had formed, I guess you could say that I had adapted and adjusted to. So that was my normal, I put it that way. I didn't feel particularly traumatized per se.
Right. Yeah, there's a certain cushioning effect that happens when this is what you've known and when there's nothing else to compare it with. Where do you think this trauma came from? What do you attribute your grandfather's anger and the drinking? What do you attribute it to?
One of the things that I will tell you is that being a Cherokee Nation citizen, part of how they identify who we are as tribal members is to look and to see if you can directly connect through birth records to an individual who came over the Trail of Tears. So that person would be, I think it's my great-great-grandmother, and her name was Lizzie Groundhog. And Lizzie Oguna is the Cherokee pronunciation of that. She was originally from Georgia. And at 12 years old, she was marched on the Trail of Tears from Georgia to Oklahoma. And she survived that. My great-great-grandparents, the third great-grandparents, did not survive that, as none of the other people that were in my family that I know of did. She was the only survivor of that. And I am a legacy of Lizzie Groundhog, as is my grandfather. And it took, I think it was in 2012 when somebody mentioned historical trauma to me. And that was like, that hit me. It was like, that is the word. That is the experience that I've been trying to encapsulate my whole life, was historical trauma. And that's when I became interested in that and looking at that. And that theory explained many things that had happened in my family from the time, the stories that had been told about my great-great-grandmother and what she had endured, and then what my great-grandfather had endured, and that I could actually see what my grandfather had endured, and then my mother, and so on and so on.
Turning now to your journey as a psychiatric mental health nurse. Where did that begin? When did you realize that you wanted to become a nurse?
I wanted to become a nurse because my mother was a nurse. Okay. So I was lucky to have a mother who had become an RN, and I watched her work. I liked seeing what she did. I felt like she was really helping people, and that was really important to me. So I grew up and I automatically just decided nursing is the way to go, and that way I'll be able to help people too. And that's how I did that. Now, my mother was an RN, and at the time, they didn't really even expect Cherokee people to go to college. They didn't think you were college material. So my mother actually went to a 3-year school at St. Edward's Hospital in Fort Smith, Arkansas, where the nuns trained her to be an extraordinary nurse. And to tell you the truth, I didn't think psychiatry or psychiatric nurse practitioner in the beginning. I worked for many years in trauma intensive care units. And I guess it was an epiphany one day when I sat down and I realized I wanted to go back to school. And I decided, I think I'll do a public health degree. So I went to school that year, and I ended up doing an internship where I was able to work in a safe house in one of the areas of Boston that was underserved. And I worked with dually diagnosed women who had HIV. Now, my role as a student at that time in public health was to look at where they were with their HIV and help them develop strategies on how they could modify their life and improve their overall health. At that time, looking at that, I realized, oh my God, this really emphasized that there's not an equal playing field here. These were all women. And I realized that in some ways, their whole worldview, their whole life experience was in this little bubble in this area of the Boston area, and that they had been trafficked sexually. They had drug use problems. They were involved in domestic violence relationships. And I just realized, my gosh, they don't have any idea what the rest of the world looks like. They can't see it. It was a lot like what my experience was when I was a child. I didn't know. That was my worldview at the time when I was a kid, right? Growing up in that situation with my family. So I decided at that point in time, I was going to go for another year, and I became a psychiatric nurse practitioner at that time.
And what brought you back to looking at the Indigenous community and also pursuing your studies further to get your doctorate?
In 2012, I found out my son, who was in Hawaii, they were going to have their first child. And so when I went back to Hawaii, because I had lived there previously too, I decided to work at the university. When I was at the university at the School of Nursing, one of the professors asked me, why don't you complete a PhD? I had previously completed a DNP while I was still in Massachusetts. And I did that because it was there, because it wasn't far from my home. And I felt like that helped establish a level of professionalism with psychiatric nurse practitioners that I wanted. Kind of dangled a carrot in front of me and said, you can work with Indigenous populations if you would like. And that did it. And so that was the beginning.
And before we take a break and dive into your research interests further, I wanted to ask, have you been back to where you grew up, to the Cherokee lands? And what was the reaction from the community when they see you coming as Dr. Cynthia Greywolf now?
That's a good question. You asked me, how do they react to me? I am a totally different person now than the kid that I was, or even the young woman that I was. And yet at the same time, I don't fit like I used to. So I feel like in some ways, getting this education is wonderful. It's been wonderful for me, but it also, you realize that you have sacrificed some things with the family because they have not left there. That's their bubble. That's how they see things. So I'm an oddity, I guess, is how I would describe it sometimes. And everything about me has changed from the way that I spoke when I was a child, for example. I speak very differently now. I'm just a very different person with memories of being that child. And actually, when I first started school, I was rejected. I was rejected and kind of distanced in a lot of ways. It was a very painful thing. So I was gone actually for a number of years. But when I came back, I found that I was finally accepted.
Why did they reject you?
They rejected me because it's kind of a hard question to answer. It's kind of close to me in some ways, but I think it's because I had a few family members say things like, oh, you think you're better than we are. You think you're going to do this or that. And it really wasn't about that. Somehow I found myself on a path that I enjoyed and that I could follow. And I loved academia. And that's kind of a shock because where I grew up, you would never even think that somebody like me would even have an opportunity to do that at all. Nobody talked about college. Nobody talked about mainly it was like they would just be happy if you graduate from high school. And my uncle and my cousin didn't graduate from high school. Eventually, they got their GEDs. And I think that's great for them because it's a huge accomplishment for them. And there are a handful in my family that actually have college degrees now. And so at least of my generation that I can think of, maybe one other person that I can think of that's kind of close to me. So my uncle finally asked me one day, and this wasn't too long ago, he said, how'd you do it? And I said, how did I do what? And he goes, how did you become successful? And I said, gosh, that came at me out of the blue. And I thought, I have to think about that and how I'm going to answer that to him because I couldn't just give him my rote response. I had to really think about how I would present that because he was really asking honestly at this point about that.
Well, thank you for sharing your story, Dr. Cynthia Greywolf. Let's take a break now, and we will be right back. You are listening to Mental Health Trailblazers, Psychiatric Nurses Speak Up, brought to you by the SAMHSA Minority Fellowship Program at the American Nurses Association. The stigma about mental health or substance abuse issues is particularly prevalent in underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. One way to overcome that stigma is to recruit more nurses from all underrepresented communities into these fields so that they can focus on eliminating stigma about mental illness and substance use through their leadership in research, practice, education, and policy development. Receiving treatment from someone with a similar background builds trust that can lead to better outcomes. The SAMHSA Minority Fellowship Program at the American Nurses Association is actively engaged in identifying and supporting nursing students seeking graduate degrees in psychiatric mental health nursing. Visit emfb.org to learn more. Welcome back, Dr. Greywolf. At this point, I'd like us to turn to your research interests and take a deeper dive into some of what you were mentioning earlier. For example, intergenerational trauma. Could you share what exactly that means and why it's important to you?
I became interested in historical trauma, which is also looking at intergenerational trauma and how that's passed on. And I became interested in that because when I was in Hawaii, one of my professors said she had an interest in historical trauma. And I realized when she said those words that was what that just coined the whole experience that my family had had. I could just read into that, and I thought that really resonates with me. So I worked for a couple of years before I did begin their doctoral program. And what I did when I got into the Minority Fellowship Program was because it's focused on substance use, and because I was living in Hawaii at that time, I focused on Native Hawaiian population. When I began my research on historical trauma, there's a lot of research involving Native Americans and some involving Alaska Natives, but there was very little that focused on looking at historical trauma theory in Native Hawaiians. And at the time, I found one article that was focused specifically using that theory with Native Hawaiian college students. And I realized, oh my gosh, this is an area that I'm going to look at with Native Hawaiians because I was living in a rural area too of Hawaii. I could see that this population had experienced historical trauma too. And I wanted to explore that in the context of alcohol use. And at the time when I was at the university, I remember that it wasn't very well known how much of a problem Native Hawaiians actually had with alcohol. We knew that a lot of people used methamphetamine. I mean, there was a lot of prevalence of use of certain things. But I was really interested in historical trauma and the use of alcohol because it took me back to my grandfather's experience. And I always felt that he used alcohol to help manage his anger and a lot of the losses that he felt, because that's what basically my family had always said. So I wanted to look at this with Native Hawaiians. And so ultimately, I completed a dissertation working in a remote area of Hawaii. I lived there for 2 years, immersed in the culture, and became accepted within the community, working at the community health center that I worked at. And basically what my title of my dissertation came out to be, like exploring a shared history of colonization, historical trauma, and alcohol use among Native Hawaiians, because I knew anecdotally from my practice, I knew that this was going on. So my topic became very exploratory because I could find a lot of research that would focus on how colonization and historically traumatic events would impact, say, cardiovascular disease or high blood pressure. But I only found that one article that used the theory of historical trauma to explicitly explore alcohol use in Native Hawaiian college students. So moving forward, I realized that I was going to have to use a lot of the literature on Native Americans. I confined it to just North America, well, the United States, I should say the United States. And as I started to do the research and I started to look at it, the concept of historical trauma, it was first actually hypothesized in the 1960s. And the concept was at that time associated with the psychoanalytical case studies of persistent trauma symptoms that were experienced by Jewish Holocaust survivors and their descendants after World War II. And that literature actually provided a theoretical foundation and applied body of knowledge for the expansion of the concept to include American Indians. And Maria Braveheart is a Native who first developed the theory of historical trauma and modified this along with 2 other Native American researchers as well. And that was very interesting to me. Maria Braveheart, I believe, is Lakota, and she developed the seminal works on this. So that was how I began with this. And of course, being a psychiatric nurse practitioner, I'd always worked with people that have PTSD, that kind of trauma that's always, I see a lot of that in practice, especially at a federally qualified health center. And just to kind of tell you the difference between what historical trauma is and what PTSD is, historical trauma is something that impacts groups of people. Okay, they have a shared or collective experience of a traumatic event. PTSD affects individuals. Okay, so individuals within a group of people that have historical trauma can have PTSD, but not everybody has PTSD. And maybe not everybody suffers the consequences of historical trauma per se, but that's kind of how I was looking at this. I did an exploratory or qualitative study just to explore how much this impacts Native Hawaiians in the area that I was living and working in. And I found that they had, in fact, experienced a lot of the same things that I had experienced when I was a child. I could really identify. And so I picked a model when I was doing my dissertation that would allow me to account for my own experience, to try to keep as much bias out of it as possible. So that's how I got my beginning. One of the things that I was able to determine was, as with Native Americans, it appears that alcohol was also used as a force in colonial expansion. The other finding I had was that a number of them in the area where I did research had told me that they experienced a lot of the symptoms that are described in historical trauma theory. and that they use substances to help cover up feelings of anger and loss that they still feel. So that was very similar to what was experienced by Natives in the U.S. and elsewhere.
Looking now at the role of psychiatric mental health nurses in addressing this historical trauma, what is it that your research is trying to do? How would you like to use your findings to intervene and reverse some of these traumatic experiences and improve the lives of the communities that you've been studying?
Well, I've been working with Dr. Lowe. I'm beginning my second year as a postdoc here at University of Texas, Austin. And I'm very happy to say that Dr. Lowe was very helpful in helping me acquire a grant from the Native Alcohol Center for Alcohol and Education. And I'm going to be working with the Katua in Oklahoma. He has the talking circle that he uses as an interventional tool to help Native youth to become self-reliant. He uses self-reliance theory, and that is being responsible to yourself, and then helps Natives learn about the strength of their ancestors, what their ancestors went through, and to develop a sense of pride in order to be self-reliant. I'll put it that way. So he's done tremendous work in this area. And so my new study will be looking at the past intervention that they did in 2019 as an alcohol prevention measure in some young adults, Native American young adults. We'll be looking at how they did with the COVID-19 pandemic. Was that a big stressor? That was obviously a big stressor. And then how did they fare over this period of time? How well did that intervention hold up? Were they able to abstain from using alcohol? And, in talking to Dr. Lowe, one of my things that I'm really interested in is looking at, perhaps epigenetic changes in populations. But with natives have been not treated well in research in the past, so they're not as apt to trust researchers. A lot of researchers have come in, they've gotten what they want, they leave, there's no benefit to the tribe. A lot of times people in different tribes have been hurt by what's happened with how the research that's been done previously is used. So even though I'm Cherokee, it's that still doesn't mean that you're going to be trusted to do that level of research. You have to really gain the trust, I would say, of the people that you're going to be working with, and make sure that you have the integrity to really keep that as they would like it. And I'm hoping that I'd be able to look at some of these issues in the future. That would really be exciting to me. I'd be working with a team of people. It wouldn't just be me. It would be a team of people that are experts in that field. And that is my purpose, is to help Native people, the Indigenous people, with their health outcomes. Because really, the theory with epigenetic traits are that you can reverse that. How do you reverse that and heal people? How do people heal themselves, right? It's along those lines. How do you heal? How do you become healthier? How do you help them outcomes improve?
When you go into reservations or communities that are disadvantaged, especially when you compare the divergence in fortunes within this country, when you talk to Native youth, do they blame what happened to their ancestors for the conditions that they're in today?
Oh, yes, definitely. Definitely. I can say that, the Navajo, I worked with the Navajo for a while when I was in New Mexico in the Four Corners area. I worked with a lot of Navajo patients that came in, and yes, definitely they blamed the U.S. government and colonization as a cause for the kind of problems that they were having. You have variations of the theme. There are some people that are doing well that don't think about that. that they've been pretty well assimilated and they can kind of navigate between their culture and the mainstream culture. But then there are others that do not. When I was a psychiatric nurse practitioner there, I'm a psychopharmacologist, meaning that I had 15-minute slots to assess whether or not a medication was working for, say, a depression, PTSD, or anxiety, et cetera. That's not very long, and that's not the native way of doing things. It's a very Western way. So when I actually would treat people that wanted me to actually work with them from an Indigenous point of view, native to native, I would actually have to go to my boss and say, look, I need an hour with this person because the 15-minute time slot does not work, and we won't make any progress if we just have that slot. And usually people would have to drive 100 miles sometimes to come in for a 15-minute appointment, and they would have problems with transportation, et cetera, and so on. So it was really hard. So generally, when it was a Native person, most of the time, it would be somebody that I would find would have pretty severe PTSD and multiple episodes of traumas that had happened over their life. And they would also have problems with alcohol, often methamphetamine, and they would have problems with the police and so on. A lot of times they would end up even coming to see me because it was court mandated. So once they came to see me, I would really try to make a plan to really help. And oftentimes the type of methodology that I would use there would be like, even two people can be a talking circle. So I would use this talking circle kind of to help develop this relationship, to help this person and listen to their story and try to find inroads on how we could help them become self-reliant and let them heal and find their path to healing. And that's how I would typically do that in that setting. It was different in Hawaii, for example. I could spend an hour with almost everybody and not prescribe any medications there. They didn't believe in medications. So that's kind of a little bit of difference.
And have you found that this culturally appropriate intervention, this talking circle, how effective has it been to address substance use problems that you've experienced?
What I can tell you, I'll give you an experience. I can tell you about one young man. Let's call him Jesse. Okay. Jesse came to me. It was court mandated. Jesse was Navajo. He lived about, well into the Navajo reservation, didn't have running water. Most of the time, didn't have transportation. His brother lived in a nearby home and was cooking methamphetamine. There was a big problem. The Navajo tribal police were involved all the time. And Jesse was involved with all kinds of violent escapades, and the police were always taking him in. And it would be not only on the reservation, but also outside the reservation. That was how he was put in jail, like in the area. And then that's how he came to me at the community health center. And I remember that when he came in, he was a man that had, I can't tell you how many Western diagnoses, like from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, psychosis, just enormous amount of diagnoses. And I thought right there, that's a problem. So I negotiated with Jesse that I would spend an hour with him every week if he would agree to come in to see me. And he agreed that would work because for him, 15-minute time slots wouldn't work. And I realized that. And part of this whole process was like a talking circle. And Jesse had to vet me because of how I look. I'm assimilated Cherokee. So some of his questions are, why are your Cherokee people always so fair and blonde? So we had to go through some of the policies that the U.S. established that impacted that and how that was facilitated and how that was different perhaps than saying Navajo live on a reservation. I worked with Jesse. He weighed, at the time he came in, I think it was like almost about 400 pounds. And a lot of that had been caused by psychiatric meds. And so over a period of 2 years, I weaned him off of all the medications and I got rid of all the diagnoses that he had been given. And he was diagnosed with a complex form of post-traumatic stress disorder. And then, of course, methamphetamine and alcohol use disorder. And then I also got him, he had to do this on his own. I gave him a website where he could look at and follow a diet that wasn't a diet. It was just healthy eating plan and exercise. He had to commit to exercising so much every day. And he lost over 200 pounds in those 2 years that I worked with him. And he came pretty religiously to see me. And by the time I left, he had reestablished himself as an artist, which was what he did. And he was a good one. And he was beginning to sell his work again. He was going to art shows in places like Santa Fe and other places to sell his art. He was one of my success stories. But I didn't do this alone. We also had a tribal sweat lodge, and there was like a medicine person from the Navajo Nation who helped as well, because I used to send Jesse there because he had to have that piece of this too, to help him develop that sense of pride in being Navajo and a pride in who he is, to help him become self-reliant in his life and to self-actualize, which he did with his art.
It sounds like a very good formula for achieving success, as you put it. How do we take this to scale and make sure that you don't have failures, that people do get that cultural affirmation, all the support that they need to get over the challenges that they're facing and become productive, constructive citizens?
That is what Dr. Lowe's work is all about. There needs to be more Native researchers who are out there and can work. There's so many tribes, so many people, right? So many Native people, so many people, period, that have been impacted by all this. I think part of it is you need people that are willing to do the work. And our Western model, I've always felt like, and this is one of my biggest frustrations, it does not work for everybody. It works for a few people, really, in the scheme of things. If somebody that can come in and say, yeah, Prozac works or it doesn't work. But there are people that don't choose to take medication. And actually, I honestly think that there are many people where maybe the medication might take the edge off of some symptoms, but you really have to look at, and I don't know if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but the very bottom of that TP is where safety needs, where you have a safe home, you have enough to eat, you have all the supports you need. Most of the people that I work with did not have stable lives. So until that part was stabilized, you were not going to make much progress. That's where you need to go in. But you have to look at who are the people that you're treating, who are they culturally, who are they as a person, how will you tailor your treatment to their needs. I'm speaking as a psychiatric provider there, one-on-one with somebody, or maybe in a group. I didn't run groups, but this is where I would say Western medicine fails a lot of Natives. There needs to be a different treatment modality because Natives think in a very circular way, not linear. In other words, Natives don't think about necessarily owning land per se. What they think about, they don't think of capitalism per se. They've kind of been, I always felt like, kind of forced into that. But they think about their community first. Just like, how is my community going to be benefited? It's like they're connected to family, community, and tribe, that sort of thing. You have to think about that and how they think, how their worldview is, and then treat them according to that and where they're at in that.
And if somebody with a problem is seeking care, or as you said earlier, people are mandated by courts to get psychiatric or mental health care, who is providing that care? I mean, Jesse was lucky to have you. Typically, what kind of care would a Native person receive, and from whom?
What, from who? So, yes, in this particular case, the community health center that I worked with had a contract with the courts, and that was one of the reasons why the court sent them to us. Now, just to give you an example, Jesse had gotten all those previous diagnoses from a practitioner who was not Native. And so to that person, all this behavior looked bipolar, psychotic, schizophrenic, right? Without knowing the history of what's happened to Native people. And that's not an accusation or any way meant to be a criticism. If you don't know, you just don't know, right? It just so happened that I just happened to be there when Jesse happened to be a patient. It was just purely by coincidence, because at this point, because it's a community health center, they have a high turnover rate of providers, and the model is 15-minute appointments. So I basically, like when I was there, like I said, I negotiated with my boss about can I take this amount of time with this patient? And it was like only if they show up, because if they don't show up, that's 4 appointments that you could have had with other people. So it's a very capitalistic, very fee-for-service type of approach, which I don't find that helpful with some people, with most people, to tell you the truth. And that, because I really needed a team of people to help with like housing, food, like a lot of things, like also alcohol abuse and treatment. Methamphetamine was a huge issue as well. So we needed a lot of different people working to help as a team with this. That's what I see as being helpful.
Yeah, I think really strong arguments for rethinking how healthcare is practiced, how it's taught, and then also a strong argument for increasing the number of practitioners from underserved communities. And with that, we will be right back. You are listening to Mental Health Trailblazers, Psychiatric Nurses Speak Up, brought to you by the SAMHSA Minority Fellowship Program at the American Nurses Association. Listen to all of our podcasts at emfp.org, the SAMHSA MFP at ANA's YouTube channel, or on your preferred podcast app. For more information about the MFP or to provide your feedback, email us at mfp@ana.org and look for us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Then click subscribe, like, or follow. So welcome back, Dr. Greywolf, and now we're going to switch it up just a little bit and try to lighten up our discussion. And I'm going to ask you a few questions, which I hope to get tweet-sized sound bites for. And let me start by asking who your nursing hero is and why.
Well, I would have to go back to my mother again, okay, because she was the first person that popped into my head. I just remember her wearing her beautiful white uniform and saving the world is how I saw her.
Okay. And who would you pick to play you for the film version of your life?
Gosh, I looked at that question. I have no idea who I would pick to play me. Could I pick somebody like Angelina Jolie? I'm just teasing. Oh. But anyway, I really honestly couldn't really say.
Oh, I think you picked somebody very good. You know what? We might try and get her to cover these subject materials. She might be interested. You never know. And continuing on the whole media and movie trail, what is your greatest pet peeve with the way Indigenous people are portrayed in the movies and the media?
Oh my gosh. When I look back to my childhood, it's like there's so many things. They used to always have people of European descent playing natives, for example, in the movies. I just remember this as a kid. Natives are always the bad guy. They're always the ones that are the problem. Plus, there's a stereotypical look that they assume that all natives have big feather headdresses and that sort of thing. That's not true. Not everybody lived in teepees, for example. So those are some of my pet peeves from just watching movies generically. Things have gotten a little better, I would say. More recently, there's a Cherokee actor, what is his name? Wes Studi, who's most recently been playing. And he's full-blood Cherokee, I'm very proud to say. Full-blood Cherokee from Oklahoma. He's in his 70s now, and he has been playing a lot of Native roles, so I'm proud to say that.
Turning to you again, if you could share your favorite personal motto or favorite quote.
Gosh, I have one that comes to mind. It's like, live life like somebody left the gates open. And if you can visualize horses running through the gate when the gates open and thundering out, that's pretty much my motto and how I live my life.
And I think you've been quite successful with that, looking at your CV and the CV of all the Minority Fellowship Program family that I've had the privilege and honor to interview for this podcast. It's incredible, valuable accomplishment. So yeah, I can see how that is a personal motto, and not more than just a motto, something that you live by. And in this day and age of technology and so many competing and combating sources of news and information, where do you go for your news and your information?
I listen to CNN. I'm kind of a CNN junkie, actually. It's always in the background.
And what is prominently featured on your home or office wall?
Horses thundering out of the gate, you might say. Seriously, I have always grown up loving horses, and I have several horse paintings in my home. Reminds me of Oklahoma, reminds me of being home.
I wanted to find out a little bit more about your engagement with the Minority Fellowship Program. What role do you think it's played in your trajectory as a nurse scientist?
Gosh, I would tell you it has everything to do with my success as a nurse scientist. I would say that without the support of the Minority Fellowship and the family and Dr. Lowe, I would not have been successful. I owe everything that I've accomplished in the last 6-7 years to the Minority Fellowship. They're wonderful support, always there, always had my back, always there to offer some suggestion or help with manuscript or help with how to proceed.
I get a sense that it's more than just the 1 or 2 years that you are enrolled as an actual fellow, that the experience becomes lifelong. Is that something that you are seeing?
Yes, they have become my family. They have become part of me. I think of them throughout my academia, whatever I'm doing. I keep up with that. I keep up with what people are doing. I'm so proud of them. Yeah, they're just amazing people, just amazing accomplishments, such interesting research interests.
Anything more that you'd like to see from the fellowship program?
It's hard, but I would like to see more Native nurses get involved with the fellowship, right? And I think that you've probably heard from Dr. Lowe that there are only about 25 of us out of how many millions of people there are in the country. 25 Native nurse PhD researchers. That's kind of staggering when you think about it. I would love to see more Native nurses encouraged to come into the field and go through the Minority Fellowship for that support. And I would love to see them go back to help their tribes or to help other tribes or other Native peoples or other peoples that have been disadvantaged throughout this whole process that we go through all the time. I mean, we have traumas going on right now, right? There's always something going on in the world. So we really need mental health.
And do you have any suggestions for how the Minority Fellowship Program can recruit more Native nurses? Because this past recruitment phase, we made a big effort and it's hard.
Yeah, where are they? It's like how many Natives actually think that they can go to college? And so I know I speak only anecdotally, and I'm speaking specifically from working in Hawaii and working in, like, say, with the Navajo. They just didn't see that they could even go to college sometimes. Maybe the real younger generation, maybe now, some of the people from where I worked in Hawaii, some of their kids are going to school elsewhere. But generally speaking, I don't know how many of those individuals go into nursing. What I do know in Hawaii is that I have a friend and a colleague at University of Hawaii School of Nursing who actually has a program that's dedicated specifically to getting Native nurses into the school. So she has, I forget how many students that she's graduated. I think it's like 500 now. Not all of them obviously are interested in psychiatric mental health, but that is what her program, that is her explicit role, is to recruit. She's Native Hawaiian herself. So she recruits Natives into that program. I think that if there are programs out there that will look to recruit and encourage people, maybe even at the high school level, that these are opportunities for you. And this is how you can be supported throughout your career, that you can actually do it. I know for me personally, I know as a young graduated from high school, I thought I couldn't go to a really good school. I thought I wasn't smart enough. I didn't think I was good enough. I didn't think I was kind of really had terrible self-esteem. And then looking back on it, I realized, gosh, I was so traumatized and I was feeling oppressed. All this put me back in my place kind of thing was going on. And like, well, you probably shouldn't do that. Like, I think one time I mentioned to my family doctor that, well, maybe I might want to go to medical school. Oh, not you, honey. You can't do that. You need to do something else. Maybe you can be a nurse, that kind of thing. So I heard that when I was like 17. I'll never forget that. Never forget that, because who knows? I might have had a different trajectory if I hadn't been so easily discouraged. So, I mean, part of that was on me for letting that happen. But I realized looking back on it, oh my gosh, when I was just coming out of all this stuff, it's like I had a lot to sort through. And I had to grow as a person, and I had to find my strength and find my way.
Looking back now at where you started and thinking about all the challenges that you've had to overcome, what are your thoughts about all the things that you've accomplished, and where do you see yourself in the future?
I'm not one of those people that puts myself in like a category, right? So in age-wise. So for me, I will keep going till I just can't anymore, if that makes any sense. I'm just the type of person that I love so much what I'm doing. I don't see myself retiring from it, if that makes any sense. It's like I just want to, like I said, go until I can't anymore.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense. And thank you very much for sharing your story, Dr. Greywolf. It's been wonderful speaking to you today.
Thank you. It's been wonderful to be here.
And that does it for this episode of Mental Health Trailblazers, Psychiatric Nurses Speak Up. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion, and I look forward to you joining us on future episodes. This is the Minority Fellowship Program at the American Nurses Association podcast, featuring nurse scientists addressing the psychiatric and mental health issues affecting underrepresented communities across America. You can always find us online at emfp.org and wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Funding for this podcast was made possible in part by grant number 1H79SM080386-04 from SAMHSA. The views expressed by the speakers and host do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does mention of trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government.